Hey everybody, and welcome to Dominion Cards, the video series where we take a strategic, in-depth look at various cards in the board game Dominion. Today we are looking at Haven. This is a 2-cost action and duration card from Seaside, and it says +1 card, +1 action. Set aside a card from your hand face down under this. At the start of your next turn, put it into your hand. This video is going to focus solely on the unique aspects of Haven. If you want to know more about duration cards in general, I've already covered that in my Caravan video. I would go and recommend that you watch that video first if you don't really know anything about duration cards as a general concept. So what's the general idea behind Haven? So the sort of design aim of Haven is that it allows you to save a card from this turn and put it into your next one. So you can use this to try and help pair up cards that really want to be together, so for example a pair of treasure maps, or you might be able to smooth out your money distribution. So if you get too much money on one turn, you can try shunting money over to your next hand to be more consistent in the types of cards you can buy. It might also be the case that you make junk cards miss a shuffle by just having them not drop into your discard pile at the end of the turn. You get to avoid drawing them at any point during your next shuffle. But bear in mind that if you save aside a useful playable card with Haven, then what that does mean is that you don't get to actually play that card this turn. Right? It's going to have to wait until next turn until you get to do that. Now, something that's very important to note with Haven is that setting aside another card is forced, and you must do it if you can. Bear in mind that it is actually possible to end up in a situation where there is no card left to actually set aside, and that will be the case that Haven is the only card remaining in your hand, draw pile and discard pile. Like, for example, everything else is in play. If that's the case, Haven doesn't actually stay out in play between turns because it's not doing anything on the next turn, so it will actually drop straight into your discard pile at the end of the turn. Now, the fact that Haven forces you to set aside a card is a big problem for it, and it makes it much weaker. If it was optional, then Haven would be a much better card, but it isn't, and so you have to deal with that with Haven. Now, bear in mind that when you play a Haven, your hand size will go down by 1, because although you draw a card, you do also have to put a card aside when you play it. But on the next turn, your hand size will increase by 1. So is Haven good or bad with cards that care about or change your hand size? And I think it's a bit of a wash. So it might seem like risky if there's a militia on the board, because you've got this really low hand size already. But bear in mind that if you played Haven on the previous turn, well, when you start your turn, your hand size is going to jump up again, so that actually might be good. And similarly, you might think about a card like Diplomat, where you might think to yourself, hey, if I play a Haven, I get to set aside a card, and then now I'm down to 4 cards in hand, so I can trigger a Diplomat and get the actions from it. But then you can't actually do that every turn, because at the start of your next turn, that Haven is now going to bump your hand size up to 6, and then it's like, oh, now it's even more difficult to actually play a Diplomat for actions on the next turn. And similarly, stuff like Draw to X, like, is it good, is it bad? It's going to alternate between turns. It's a bit of a wash overall, so I don't really think that that's too much of a consideration. Now, if you are forced to set aside a card at a time when you don't want to, this can actively hurt you and make your turn worse. So the big problem here is that sometimes you are compelled to play a Haven that's in your hand. So it might be, here's an example, let's say your hand consists of a Haven, a gold, a silver, and 2 coppers. So you've got 7 money. You'd really like to buy a province. So you say, okay, I'm going to draw a card and play the Haven. And you draw a copper. Well, now your hand contains exactly 8, but you must put one of those cards to set aside. And so you still don't get to hit 8 this turn. Now, if you'd just never bought the Haven in the first place, you would have just had that 8-card hand and made your province. So you could just not play the Haven sometimes, but then bear in mind that if you are not playing the Haven when you draw it, then it is essentially a dead junk card that's clogging up your hand. You're having to draw past it. It's wasting your stop card space. Haven, you can fall into this trap, and you really need to watch out. In fact, as a general rule, I would say that you really don't want to overgain havens, right? You are much more likely to fall into this bad situation if you do that. If you gain a lot of havens, you can end up in this situation where you are constantly having to set aside good cards and just shove them into your next hand. And in general, you would rather play your good cards now rather than next turn. And because you must set aside a card every time you play Haven, if you have a deck where you want to play every single card that you own every turn, then you shouldn't really have any Havens in it, because it forces you to not do that. Of course, in most cases, a deck, even if it's really lean and thin in the mid-game, eventually you will add some victory cards to it most of the time, right? And then you have something that you can set aside. But just keep in mind that there are some decks out there where this is not the case, and they remain very thin and very lean forever, right? Especially if there is some source of victory point tokens. In that case, they probably don't even ever need to buy a victory card at all. So an example would be the Goon's Watchtower combo. You can gain a load of points without ever adding another card into your deck, or like Bishop Fortress or something. So you just avoid Haven like the plague in those sorts of games. Like you don't want them at all. It's also worth noting that although Haven looks like a cantrip, it is not a cantrip. So if you are looking to remodel coppers into Havens, you're not really like using that as a substitute for thinning. You may find that by getting too many Havens by doing that, you just actually cause yourself a different kind of problem as well. So yeah, you've got to be real careful with Haven. Now, when I think about Haven, I see it as having three main use cases. This is not an exhaustive list of all the reasons why you might want to use Haven, but generally I find that the decks tend to fall into these three sorts of cases when I want to use Haven. So number one might be a deck that has very little draw, and it allows me to smooth out some unfortunate draws and get some consistency. It might be that I have a deck that fully draws, it's overdrawing, it has some extra components, and I get to save some spares for next turn to improve my next turn. Or I might be able to pseudo trash a bunch of useless stock cards towards the end game, like victory cards. Now, we're going to go over each of these in a little bit more detail over the next couple of slides. So, smoothing of draws. Sometimes it's not practical or possible to draw your deck and play all of your cards. And in these sorts of decks, you do run risks of having all of your treasures clumped together, or maybe you get some terminal collisions, right? Like, if you can't draw every card every turn, then you sort of are at the mercy of draw order, and there's a bit of randomness, right? That's why all of these like big money treasure focused decks tend to be very random in what they can do. So having some Havens might be good in these kinds of decks, because if you, for example, just have too much money in one hand, you get to just take some of the money out of it and shunt it to your next turn instead, and hopefully get a bit of consistency that way, or save one of the terminals to play on the next turn, for example. But bear in mind that although this sounds really good in theory, you actually need to have your Haven as part of your good turn in order to do this, right? If you draw like 5 golds, then having a load of Havens in your deck isn't really going to help you, because you don't have any Havens in your hand to start saving those golds for next turn. So yeah, you know, it's not always going to work out in this sort of deck, but sometimes it will help. Now, you don't want to get too many Havens in this kind of deck, because this sort of deck might have problems with you playing too many and reducing your hand size. So just having 1 or 2, if you've got an opportunity to pick them up, might be enough in these cases. So what about the seeding the engine for consistency? So sometimes you have decks that just have a whole bunch of gains. There might be like Ironworks, and you can just gain a whole bunch of cards, and like villages and smithies and so on. In these cases, you might be able to overdraw and overbuild your deck a little bit and end up with some spare engine components. Well, if you have all of these gains, that means you might be able to spend some of them on picking up some Havens, and then you can try and add a little bit of consistency by like shoving a spare village that you're not going to play into your next hand, and this sort of prevents you from dudding and wasting turns entirely. Like in these sorts of decks, your turns are very strong, and duds can be killer, like set you back quite a lot because you're able to do so much on your turn. So anything that just stops that from happening can be really good, and the Havens can actually help quite a lot in this case. But again, you don't really want to get too many, so this is the sort of deck where you might end up with nothing that you actually want to set aside, or you run the risk of having all of the havens be drawn early in your deck, and you're forced to play them before you finish drawing, and then you can accidentally get tripped up because you don't know what you want to set aside, and like you set aside a village, and then you run out of villages suddenly as you continue to draw your deck, right? And you might not have anything as a backup to set aside. You don't necessarily want to be setting aside Haven with Haven. Probably means that you bought too many of them. So, if just the more copies of a type of card you buy, the more likely you are to get screwed up by random draw order from that type of card. So again, you might want to hold off on getting too many Havens in this kind of deck. Now, on the third bullet point, we talked about this thing called Pseudo Trashing. What do I mean by this? So Pseudo Trashing is what we call something like, say, the Island Mat, where you are not actually trashing a card, but you are getting it out of the way. And you can do this with Haven. If you have a pair of them, then you play one on one turn and the other one on the next turn. What you can do is you can actually keep a card out of your deck forever. So what you do is you play Haven on one turn to pick up something like a Province, a card that you're just not planning on ever playing again. Or in the case of Province, you can't play it. You just don't want it in the way. Then on the next turn, the Province will go into your starting hand, and then the next time when you draw your other Haven, you get to pick up that same Province, and in this way, the Province never re-enters your draw pile or your discard pile, and you just never have to worry about it clogging up your draws. Again, you do need two of them to do this, and you do also need to draw your deck because you don't want to miss drawing that Haven at any point. Now, once you've set this sort of thing up, gaining a lot more Havens, if you've got like a lot of spare draws or buys, doesn't necessarily cause you any problems, and that is because you've always got the junk that you set aside last turn in your hand ready to pick up again by the other Havens. So they are sort of acting a little bit like cantrips now because, you just had that bonus hand size of junk that you just then start setting aside again. Now, you can screw yourself over if you start doing something like adding in a cellar and thinking, I've got all these provinces in the start of my hand. What I'm going to do is I'm going to discard them all with the cellar to keep drawing, and then hopefully I won't need to play any of the Havens until I've redrawn them back up again. And of course, you can trap yourself doing something like that. So bear in mind that, for all intents and purposes, unless you desperately need to do it, those junk cards that you're holding aside are basically a no-go for anything other than the other Havens if you do something like this. But, this is just a nice... Is this a particularly strong effect of Haven? I think it's okay, but bear in mind that you are essentially using 4 money worth of cards, and 2 gains to essentially get rid of 1 card. And that's sort of like Island, in a way, right? Like a 4-cost card just to get rid of 1 card from your deck. And Island is not super good for that sort of effect. So, it's Haven is not necessarily a very good card. In fact, in general, I would say that Haven is a pretty weak card overall, but it's also very cheap to its benefit, to be fair. If you overbuy it, it's going to hurt you rather than help you. Now, because it's so cheap, you do get the chance to gain them opportunistically sometimes. I do consider Haven sort of like Cellar in that regard. Like, you might get the opportunity to pick one up when you just got a bit of a dud turn, and then it might be helpful for you, but you don't really want to get too many of them. So Haven's sort of the same sort of thing in that case. As a general rule, as I mentioned earlier, playing cards now is usually better than playing them on the next turn. And the thing that Haven does for you, which is to try and smooth out draws and help you connect cards together, that sort of thing, if possible, is usually better off done by just focusing on getting your draw up rather than using Haven. Haven's not a real substitute for just having a good draw deck in general, right? If you can draw more cards, then that's usually going to be better than using the Havens to try and do something similar. So Haven is pretty weak. It's only okay as a card. I think it's somewhere around bottom 20% in the community rankings. It's not super good. So don't get trapped by it. It's sort of a big take-home point. So what we're going to do now is we are going to head over to the online client, and we are going to generate some kingdoms with Haven in it, and we're going to see what use it is for us. Here we have almost no draw. We've only got Wishing Well as a way to draw. We've got Salvager for trashing, which is not great, honestly. We have Treasure Map, we have Explorer. There's Pirate Ship. So I don't think we want Pirate Ship. It's pretty hard to get rid of coppers here. There are lots of ways to gain treasures. There's Treasure Map, there's Explorer. Festival's not very good here. Fishing Village doesn't feel very good here. Even Lighthouse isn't very good. We don't really care for Pirate Ship. So this is a tremendously weak board. There's very little going on here. We don't really care about much of what's on the top row. Like, is Salvager worth it to get rid of some estates early? Is this really just like a money board without draw? That feels real bad. But it kind of is. Because this board is so weak, I wonder if Haven is actually going to be reasonable here. Maybe... Would we rather have Silvers or Wishing Wells? What is our goal? Do we get some Havens and try and collide treasure maps? Maybe we actually do that. Maybe... That feels pretty bad, though, to be honest, with very little trashing. Maybe what we can do is we can open Wishing Well and Salvager just to try and get rid of some estates. And then we can go for Treasure Map. We might buy Haven. I don't know. This feels real bad. If I hit 5 early, like on turn 3 or 4, I'm probably just going to get an Explorer instead, and I'm going to ignore Treasure Map. In fact, I think Explorer sounds pretty good here. I'm not too worried about Pirate Ship. If it gets rid of my coppers, that's helpful for me. So if my opponent wants to do that, then that's up to them. So I actually don't want Lighthouse. I'd rather be attacked by the Pirate Ship. Explorer puts new treasures into your hand anyway, so you still actually get to use them before they're at risk of being Pirate Shipped away. So yeah, this is just like Explorer, big money, with maybe a few Wishing Wells thrown in and like a Salvager. If I ever hit 2, I'm happy to pick up a Haven. But I'm not going to get that many. And if I never get Haven, then it's fine, right? It's not actually very useful for us on that board. The draw is very poor indeed. Here we have, again, Salvager as the only real trashing. This is very similar to the last board, except we've got Militia. It's just real nasty. Oh no, we've got Fishing Village Council Room with Militia. Okay, there's actually a crazy engine on this board. My mistake. This is not bad at all. This is really good. Fishing Village Council Room Militia. Yes, we should be able to use Outpost. So we're going to open with Salvager and Fishing Village, I think. I don't care about Militia that early on. I'm not in a super rush to buy these, I don't think. So I'm not super worried about Militia. I'm happy. I just really want to start focusing on trashing first. We can eventually buy a Bandit for money. I'm not worried about Pirate Ship at all. If it helps me thin my coppers, that is great. We just want to get a load of fishing villages to start drawing with Council Room. Play Outpost. It might eventually be the case that we get more Council Rooms than we need. So I would happily have a Haven to help out the Outpost turn so that I can put a spare Council Room into my Outpost turn, and then because I have fishing villages, I should be able to kick off. So Haven's actually quite nice for seeding the Outpost turn. The Outpost really wants seeding help, so it's anything you can get at all to help the Outpost will be really good there. Otherwise, this is a crazy engine that just quickly starts ballooning in the amount of money that it has because there's Bandit with a really strong draw and buys. And there's Salvager as well. You can start salvaging spare golds eventually. So, yeah, really good engine. Haven actually has some use for helping out with Outpost. So you only really need 1, but because you have a load of buys and money, I can see me maybe picking up some extra Havens, and Eventually, if I have spare havens, I can do the whole pseudo trashing of my provinces thing to just try and help out Outpost even more. So haven's all right here. You don't want it early, but eventually it will actually have a genuine good use with Outpost. So I like it here. But again, I'm not overbuying it. Just 1 or 2 or 3 or something. Like, actually, it's going to be real nice for me there, I think. So that's cool. Here there is no trashing at all. It's pirate ship again. There's lots of pirate ships. Let's see. So our draw is diplomat and nobles. I guess that's okay because we got mill, we got diplomat, we got shantytown. So I really want a lot of nobles. I think smugglers is going to be very good here because I really want to gain nobles, and it can gain nobles. So I love smugglers here, very strong. I'm going to open smugglers mill, I think, and I know that might stop me hitting 5, but that's okay because I want to be picking up like diplomats and mills early on. Now, I don't get to trash here. I'm desperately hoping my opponent picks up a pirate ship to trash my coppers. I will thank them so much. Like, pirate ship is absolutely terrible here. Now, how do I get money? Well, I'm using mill discard. Eventually, maybe I get some merchants. Having said that, there's no buy here. That's a problem. I really need smugglers in this case. This is my only source of extra gains. Maybe I get more than 1 smugglers eventually, but I start with the smugglers. And we're going to go for diplomat mill. We're going to try and draw through our junk. Maybe we're not going to draw super well. Hopefully we can get some draw up with nobles eventually, but lots of mills and nobles. This is going to allow me to build the engine because they're giving me some points. How good is Haven here? Haven, I kind of don't really like it in the face of mill diplomat. I think it makes things a little bit more inconsistent. I'd rather not have any havens here, I don't think. Like, setting aside junk isn't so good because it just gets in the way of triggering the diplomats, which are very important here. As much as they help, later on they're going to hurt. And if you try and do the pseudo trashing thing towards the end, you are consistently having high hand sizes, which you really don't want. So I think I ignore Haven here completely. I think this is a board where Haven's going to hurt me more than it helps me. So, yeah, I want to try. Just no good. Feels like setting aside junk now and then, but I think Diplomat hates Haven too much. Here we have Steward to trash. That means we get a chance to pick up 2 costs early. We don't actually want to gain too many havens in the face of that, usually. What else are we doing aside from Steward? Tactician, Wishing Well, and Steward are only draw, but our only village is Native Village, which is not so good. And Tactician. Could we do... So we have Steward, we have Baron, we have Treasury, we have Tactician, we have a way of trashing. I think this is a double Tactician board. Tactician is sort of the best draw we have. I really like that here. So this is double Tactician. We're going to get thin, we're going to get 2 Tacticians. We are going to try and play Baron, I think, to get a load of money from that, and also a bunch of treasuries. So that feels cool. I don't think Haven's very good in a double Tactician board. It feels like we're going to want to play every card that we can in our deck. So I think Haven is completely useless here. It's just going to get in the way. Well, having said that, no, Haven is only going to be useful as a pseudo trasher late. If we're going to have Haven at all, that's when it's going to be used. And we might get the opportunity to actually pick some up. We're going to have plentiful buys if we're using like Barons. For money and treasury, so maybe we do, but if we do get Haven, it's really late and it's only as a pseudo trasher. Otherwise it's not good in the face of a thin deck mid-game with like Tactician. So if we don't pick any up, I'm not that fussed on that board. Wow, what's happening here? Masquerade is thinning, as is Trading Post. So is Island, technically. What a weak board this is, except for like Masquerade. There is no village at all. So this is like Masquerade money, I think, because what in the world else are we going to do? I'm going to try and get thin with Masquerade. I'm going to be picking up silvers and golds and maybe even harems late. If I ever get a 2-cost turn, I'm actually all right to pick up Haven here because this is kind of a big money style board. Having junk picked up, or like a colliding Masquerade, is absolutely fine, right? Because I've got Masquerade, it gives me something for my Masquerades to do on the next turn. So yeah, Haven's okay here, but this is a tremendously weak board that's like dominated by Masquerade. I'm going to open Masquerade and probably Silver instead of Poacher. Well, maybe 1 Poacher is fine, actually. Yeah, I think I like that, but Masquerade is definitely the killer card here. So Masquerade Poacher as an opening. If I get 5-2, do I do Trading Post Haven? Maybe that's okay. Maybe I go Trading Post instead of Masquerade. I can always get rid of it later or pass it to my opponent and pick up a Masquerade later on. So 5-2, it's Trading Post Haven. 3-4, it's Poacher Masquerade. And it's basically like a Masquerade big money that we transition to after that. With no village, most of everything else is completely useless. We might pick up islands and harems later on because we want the points. Yeah, that's it. So Haven, okay, because it's a deck with little draw that we want to smooth money out of. So there you have it. Haven, not really some powerhouse wonder card, as you can see. It has real challenges in certain decks, and when it does have a use, it's got this tiny use that might help. The board that had Outpost was really good for Haven because Outpost takes basically any consistency and shunting cards to the start of your next turn that you can get your hands on. So that was like a specific combo that was quite nice for it. But otherwise, Haven, it is just weak, but it's also costs too. So it's not, it's not really expected to be some massive powerhouse, I guess. Anyway, hope that was useful for you. Thank you for watching, and I will see you next time. Goodbye.